All right. Chapter 6. Some consequences of the failure of the Enlightenment project. The problems of modern moral theory emerge clearly as the product of the failure of the Enlightenment project. On the one hand, the individual moral agent, freed from hierarchy and teleology, conceives of himself and is conceived of by moral philosophers as sovereign in his moral authority. On the other hand, the inherited, if partially transformed rules of morality have to be found some new status, deprived as they have been of their older teleological character and their even more ancient categorical character as expressions of an ultimately divine law. If such rules cannot be found a new status which will make appeal to them rational, appeal to them will indeed appear as a mere instrument of individual desire and will. Hence, there is a pressure to vindicate them, either by devising some new teleology or by finding some new categorical status for them. The first project is what lends its importance to utilitarianism. The second, to all those attempts to follow Kant in presenting the authority of the appeal to moral rules as grounded in the nature of practical reason. Both attempts, so I shall argue, failed and continue to fail, but in the course of the attempt to make them successful, social as well as intellectual transformations were accomplished. Bentham's original formulations suggest a shrewd perception of the nature and scale of the problems confronting him. His innovative psychology provided a view of human nature in the light of which the problem of assigning a new status to moral rules can be clearly stated, and Bentham did not flinch from the notion that he was assigning a new status to moral rules and giving a new meaning to key moral concepts. Traditional morality was, on his view, pervaded by superstition. It was not until we understood that the only motives for human action are attraction to pleasure and aversion to pain that we can state the principles of an enlightened morality, for which the prospect of the maximum pleasure and absence of pain provides a telos. The term pleasure Bentham took to be the name of a type of sensation, just as the term pain is, and sensations of both types vary only in number, intensity, and duration. It is worth taking note of this false view of pleasure, if only because Bentham's immediate utilitarian successors were so apt to see this as the major source of the difficulties that arise for utilitarianism. They therefore did not always attend adequately to the way in which he makes the transition from his psychological thesis that mankind has two and only two motives to his moral thesis that out of the alternative actions or policies between which we have to choose at any given moment, we ought always to perform that action or implement that policy which will produce as its consequence the greatest happiness. That is, the greatest possible quantity of pleasure with the smallest possible quantity of pain, of the greatest number. It is, of course, on Bentham's view, the enlightened, educated mind, and it alone, which will recognize that the pursuit of my happiness as dictated by my pleasure-seeking, pain-avoiding psychology, and the pursuit of the greatest happiness of the greatest number do, in point of fact, coincide. But it is the aim of the social reformer to reconstruct the social order so that even the unenlightened pursuit of happiness will produce the greatest possible happiness for the greatest possible number. From this aim spring Bentham's numerous proposed legal and penal reforms. Note that the social reformer could not himself find a motive for setting himself to those particular tasks rather than others, were it not the case that an enlightened regard for one's own happiness here and now, even in as unreformed a legal social order as late 18th and early 19th century England, will lead inexorably to the pursuit of the greatest happiness. This is an empirical claim. Is it true? It took a nervous breakdown by John Stuart Mill, at once the first Benthamite child and clearly the most distinguished mind and character ever to embrace Benthamism, to make it clear to Mill himself, at least, that it is not. Mill concluded that it was Bentham's concept of happiness that needed reforming. But what he had actually succeeded in putting in question was the derivation of the morality from the psychology. Yet this derivation provided the whole of the rational grounding for Bentham's project of a new naturalistic teleology. It is not surprising that as this failure was recognized within Benthamism, its teleological content became more and more meager. John Stuart Mill was right, of course, in his contention that the Benthamite conception of happiness stood in need of enlargement. In the book Utilitarianism, he attempted to make a key distinction between so-called higher and so-called lower pleasures, and in the book on liberty and elsewhere, he connects increase in human happiness with the extension of human creative powers. But the effect of these emendations is to suggest what is correct, but what no Benthamite, no matter how far reformed, could concede, that the notion of human happiness is not a unitary, simple notion and cannot provide us with a criterion for making our key choices. If someone suggests to us, in the spirit of Bentham and Mill, that we should guide our choices by the prospects of our own future pleasure or happiness, the appropriate retort is to inquire, but which pleasure, which happiness ought to guide me? For there are too many different kinds of enjoyable activity, too many different modes in which happiness is achieved, and pleasure or happiness are not states of mind for the production of which these activities and modes are merely alternative means. The pleasure of drinking Guinness, that's all hyphenated, pleasure of drinking Guinness, is not the pleasure of swimming at Crane's Beach, that's all hyphenated. And the swimming and the drinking are not two different means for providing the same end state. The happiness which belongs peculiarly to the way of life of the cloister is not the same happiness as that which belongs peculiarly to the military life. For different pleasures and different happiness are to a large degree incommensurable. That is, there are no scales of quality or quantity on which to weigh them. Consequently, appeal to the criteria of pleasure will not tell me whether to drink or swim, and appeal to those appeal to those of happiness cannot decide for me between the life of a monk and that of a soldier. To have understood the polymorphous character of pleasure and happiness is, of course, to have rendered those concepts useless for utilitarian purposes. If the prospect of his or her own future pleasure or happiness cannot, for the reasons which I have suggested, provide criteria for solving the problem of action in the case of each individual, it follows that the notion of the greatest happiness of the greatest number is a notion without any clear content at all. It is indeed a pseudo-concept available for a variety of ideological uses, but no more than that. Hence, when we encounter its use in practical life, it is always necessary to ask what actual project or purpose is being concealed by its use. To say this is not, of course, to deny that many of its uses have been in the service of socially beneficial ideals. Chadwick's radical reforms in the provision of public health measures, Mill's own support for the extension of the suffrage and for the end to the subjugation of women, and a number of other 19th century ideals and causes all invoked the standard of utility to some good purpose. But the use of a conceptual fiction in a good cause does not make it any less a fiction. We shall have to notice the presence of some other fictions in modern moral discourse later in the argument, but before we do so, it is necessary to consider one more feature of 19th century utilitarianism. It was a mark of the moral seriousness and strenuousness of the great 19th century utilitarians that they felt a continuing obligation to scrutinize and re-scrutinize their own positions so that they might, if all possible, not be deceived. The culminating achievement of that scrutiny was the moral philosophy of Sidgwick, and it was with Sidgwick that the failure to restore a teleological framework for ethics finally comes to be accepted. He recognized both that the moral injunctions of utilitarianism could not be derived from any psychological foundations, and that the precepts which enjoin us to pursue the general happiness are logically independent of, and cannot be derived from, any precepts enjoining the pursuit of our own happiness. Our basic moral beliefs have two characteristics. Sidgwick found himself forced to conclude not entirely happily. They do not form any kind of unity. They are irreducibly heterogeneous, and their acceptance is and must be unargued. At the foundation of moral thinking lie beliefs in statements for the truth of which no further reason can be given. To such statements Sidgwick, borrowing the word from Whewell, gives the name intuitions. Sidgwick's disappointment with the outcome of his own inquiry is evident in his announcement that where he had looked for cosmos, he in fact found only chaos. It was, of course, from Sidgwick's final positions that Moore was presently to borrow without acknowledgment, presenting his borrowings with his own penumbra of bad argument in Principia Ethica. The important differences between Principia Ethica and Sidgwick's later writings are ones of tone rather than of substance. What Sidgwick portrays as failure, Moore takes to be an enlightening and liberating discovery. And Moore's readers, for whom, as I noticed earlier, the enlightenment and the liberation were paramount, saw themselves as rescued thereby from Sidgwick and any other utilitarianism as decisively as from Christianity. What they did not see, of course, was that they had also been deprived of any ground for the claims to objectivity, and that they had begun in their own lives and judgments to provide the evidence to which emotivism was soon to appeal so cogently. The history of utilitarianism thus links historically the 18th century project of justifying morality and the 20th century's decline into emotivism. But the philosophical failure of utilitarianism and its consequences at the level of thought and theory are, of course, only one part of the relevant history. For utilitarianism appeared in a variety of social embodiments and left its mark upon a variety of social roles and institutions, and these remained as an inheritance long after utilitarianism had lost the philosophical importance which John Stuart Mill's exposition had conferred upon it. But although this social inheritance is far from unimportant to my central thesis, I shall delay remarking upon it until I have considered the failure of a second philosophical attempt to give an account of how the autonomy of the moral agent might be consistently combined with a view of moral rules as having an independent and objective authority. Utilitarianism advanced its most successful claims in the 19th century. Thereafter, intuitionism followed by emotivism held sway in British philosophy, while in the United States, pragmatism provided the same kind of preparatio evangelica for emotivism that intuitionism provided in Britain. But for reasons that we have already noticed, emotivism always seemed implausible to analytic philosophers primarily concerned with questions of meaning, largely because it is evident that moral reasoning does take place, that moral conclusions can often be validly derived from sets of premises. Such analytical philosophers revived the Kantian project of demonstrating that the authority and objectivity of moral rules is precisely that authority and objectivity which belongs to the exercise of reason. Hence, their central project was, indeed is, that of showing that any rational agent is logically committed to the rules of morality in virtue of his or her rationality. I have already suggested that the variety of attempts to carry through this project and their mutual incompatibility casts doubt on their success. But it is clearly necessary to understand not only that the project fails, but why it fails, and to do this it is necessary to examine one such attempt in a little detail. The example which I have chosen is that made by Alan Gewerth in Reason and Morality. I chose Gewerth's book because it is not only one of the most recent such attempts, but also because it deals carefully and scrupulously with objections and criticisms that have been made of earlier writers. Moreover, Gewerth adopts what is at once a clear and a strict view of what reason is. In order to be admitted as a principle of practical reason, a principle must be analytic, and in order for a conclusion to follow from premises of practical reason, it must be demonstrably entailed by those premises. There is none of the looseness and vagueness about what constitutes so-called a good reason, which had weakened some earlier analytic attempts to exhibit morality as rational. The key sentence of Gewerth's book is, Since the agent regards as necessary goods, the freedom and well-being that constitute the generic features of his successful action, he logically must also hold that he has rights to these generic features, and he implicitly makes a corresponding rights claim. Gewerth's argument may be spelled out as follows. Every rational agent has to recognize a certain measure of freedom and well-being as prerequisites for the exercise of rational agency. Therefore, each rational agent must will, if he is to will at all, that he possess that measure of these goods. This is what Gewerth means when he writes in the sequence quoted of necessary goods. And there is clearly no reason to quarrel with Gewerth's argument so far. It turns out to be the next step that is at once crucial and questionable. Gewerth argues that anyone who holds that the prerequisites for his exercise of rational agency are necessary goods is logically committed to holding that he has a right to these goods. But quite clearly, the introduction of the concept of a right needs justification, both because it is at this point a concept quite new to Gewerth's argument, and because of the special character of the concept of a right. It is first of all clear that the claim that I have a right to do or have something is a quite different type of claim from the claim that I need or want or will be benefited by something. From the first, if it is the only relevant consideration, it follows that others ought not to interfere with my attempts to do or have whatever it is, whether it is for my own good or not. From the second, it does not, and it makes no difference what kind of good or benefit is at issue. Another way of understanding what has gone wrong with Gewerth's argument is to understand why this step is so essential to his argument. It is of course true that if I claim a right in virtue of my possession of certain characteristics, then I am logically committed to holding that anyone else with the same characteristics also possesses this right. But it is just this property of necessary universalizability that does not belong to claims about either the possession of or the need or desire for a good, even a universally necessary good. One reason why claims about goods necessary for rational agency are so different from claims to the possession of rights is that the latter in fact presupposes, as the former do not, the existence of a socially established set of rules. Such sets of rules only come into existence at particular historical periods, under particular historical circumstances. They are in no way universal features of the human condition. Gewerth readily acknowledges that expressions such as a right in English and cognate terms in English and other languages only appeared at a relatively late point in the history of the language toward the close of the Middle Ages, but he argues that the existence of such expressions is not a necessary condition for the embodiment of the concept of a right in forms of human behavior, and in this at least he is clearly right. But the objection that Gewerth has to meet is precisely that those forms of human behavior which presuppose notions of some ground to entitlement, such as the notion of a right, always have a highly specific and socially local character, and that the existence of particular types of social institution or practice is a necessary condition for the notion of a claim to the possession of a right being an intelligible type of human performance. As a matter of historical fact, such types of social institution or practice have not existed universally in human societies. Lacking any such social form, the making of a claim to a right would be like presenting a check for payment in a social order that lacked the institution of money. Thus, Giverth has illicitly smuggled into his argument a conception which does not in any way belong, as it must do if his case is to succeed to the minimal characterization of a rational agent. I take it, then, that both the utilitarianism of the middle and late 19th century and the analytical moral philosophy of the middle and late 20th century are alike unsuccessful attempts to rescue the autonomous moral agent from the predicament in which the failure of the Enlightenment project of providing him with a secular, rational justification for his moral allegiances has left him. I have already characterized that predicament as one in which the price paid for liberation from what appeared to be the external authority of traditional morality was the loss of any authoritative content from the would-be moral utterances of the newly autonomous agent. Each moral agent now spoke unconstrained by the externalities of divine law, natural teleology, or hierarchical authority. But why should anyone else now listen to him? It was and is to this question that both utilitarianism and analytical moral philosophy must be understood as attempting to give cogent answers, and if my argument is correct, it is precisely this question which both fail to answer cogently. Nonetheless, almost everyone, philosopher and non-philosopher alike, continues to speak and write as if one of these projects had succeeded, and hence derives one of the features of contemporary moral discourse which I noted at the outset, the gap between the meaning of moral expressions and the way in which they are put to use. For the meaning is and remains such as would have been warranted only if at least one of the philosophical projects had been successful, but the use, the emotivist use, is precisely what one would expect if the philosophical projects had all failed. Contemporary moral experience, as a consequence, has a paradoxical character, for each of us is taught to see himself or herself as an autonomous moral agent, but each of us also becomes engaged by modes of practice, aesthetic or bureaucratic, which involve us in manipulative relationships with others. Seeking to protect the autonomy that we have learned to prize, we aspire ourselves not to be manipulated by others. Seeking to incarnate our own principles and standpoint in the world of practice, we find no way open to us to do so except by directing towards others those very manipulative modes of relationships which each of us aspires to resist in our own case. The incoherence of our attitudes and our experience arises from the incoherent conceptual scheme which we have inherited. Once we have understood this, it is possible to understand also the key place that three other concepts have in the distinctively modern moral scheme: that of rights, that of protest, and that of unmasking. By the term rights, I do not mean those rights conferred by positive law or custom on specified classes of person. I mean those rights which are alleged to belong to human beings as such, and which are cited as a reason for holding that people ought not be interfered with in their pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. They are the rights which were spoken of in the 18th century as natural rights or as the rights of man. Characteristically in that century, they were defined negatively, precisely as rights not to be interfered with. But sometimes in that century, and much more often in our own, positive rights, rights to due process, to education, or to employment are examples, are added to the list. The expression human rights is now commoner than either of the 18th century expressions. But whether negative or positive, and however named, they are supposed to attach equally to all individuals, whatever their sex, race, religion, talents, or deserts, and to provide a ground for a variety of particular moral stances. It would of course be a little odd that there should be such rights attaching to human beings simply qua human beings, in light of the fact, which I have alluded to in my discussion of Giverth's argument, that there is no expression in any ancient or medieval language correctly translated by our expression a right until near the close of the Middle Ages. That is, the concept lacks any means of expression in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, or Arabic, classical or medieval, before about the year 1400, let alone in Old English or in Japanese, even as late as the mid-19th century. From this it does not, of course, follow that there are no natural or human rights. It only follows that no one could have known that there were. And this at least raises certain questions. But we do not need to be distracted into answering them, for the truth is plain. That is, there are no such rights, and belief in them is one with belief in witches and in unicorns. The best reason for asserting so bluntly that there are no such rights is indeed of precisely the same type as the best reason which we possess for asserting that there are no witches, and the best reason which we possess for asserting that there are no unicorns. That is, every attempt to give good reasons for believing that there are such rights has failed. The 18th century philosophical defenders of natural rights sometimes suggest that the assertions which state that men possess them are self-evident truths, but we know that there are no self-evident truths. 20th century moral philosophers have sometimes appealed to their and our intuitions, but one of the things that we ought to have learned from the history of moral philosophy is that the introduction of the word intuition by a moral philosopher is always a signal that something has gone badly wrong with an argument. In the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights of 1949, what has since become the normal UN practice of not giving good reasons for any assertions whatsoever is followed with great rigor. And the latest defender of such rights, Ronald Dworkin, in Taking Rights Seriously, 1976, concedes that the existence of such rights cannot be demonstrated, but he remarks on this point simply that it does not follow from the fact that a statement cannot be demonstrated that it is not true, page 81, which is true, but could equally be used to defend claims about unicorns and witches. Natural or human rights, then, are fictions, just as is utility, but fictions with highly specific properties. In order to identify them, it is worth noticing briefly once more the other moral fiction which emerges from the 18th century's attempts to reconstruct morality, the concept of utility. When Bentham first turned the term utility into a quasi-technical term, he did so, as I have already noticed, in a way that was designed to make plausible the notion of summing individual prospects of pleasures and pain. But as John Stuart Mill and other utilitarians expanded their notion of the variety of aims which human beings pursue and value, the notion of its being possible to sum all those experiences and activities which give satisfaction became increasingly implausible for reasons which I suggested earlier. The objects of natural and educated human desire are irreducibly heterogeneous, and the notion of summing them, either for individuals or for some population, has no clear sense. But if utility is thus not a clear concept, then to use it as if it is to employ it as if it could provide us with a rational criterion. It is indeed to resort to a fiction. A central characteristic of moral fictions, which comes clearly into view when we juxtapose the concept of utility to that of rights, is now identifiable. That is, they purport to provide us with an objective and impersonal criterion, but they do not. And for this reason alone, there would have to be a gap between their purported meaning and the uses to which they are actually put. Moreover, we can now understand a little better how the phenomenon of incommensurable premises in modern moral debate arises. the concept of rights was generated to serve one set of purposes as part of the social invention of the autonomous moral agent. The concept of utility was devised for quite another set of purposes, and both were elaborated in a situation in which substitute artifacts for the concepts of an older and more traditional morality were required, substitutes that had to have a radically innovated character if they were to give even an appearance of performing their new social functions. Hence, when claims invoking rights are matched against claims appealing to utility, or when either or both are matched against claims based on some traditional concept of justice, it is not surprising that there is no rational way of deciding which type of claim is to be given priority, or how one is to be weighed against the other. Moral incommensurability is itself the product of a particular historical conjunction. This provides us with an insight important for understanding the politics of modern societies. For what I described earlier as the culture of bureaucratic individualism results in their characteristic overt political debates being between an individualism which makes its claims in terms of rights and forms of bureaucratic organization which makes their claims in terms of utility. But if the concept of rights and that of utility are a matching pair of incommensurable fictions, it will be the case that the moral idiom employed can at best provide a semblance of rationality for the modern political process, but not its reality. The mock rationality of the debate conceals the arbitrariness of the will and power at work in its resolution. It is easy also to understand why protest becomes a distinctive moral feature of the modern age, and why indignation is a predominant modern emotion. The term to protest, and its Latin predecessors and French cognates are originally as often or more often positive as negative. To protest was once to bear witness to something, and only as a consequence of that allegiance to bear witness against something else. But protest is now almost entirely that negative phenomenon which characteristically occurs as a reaction to the alleged invasion of someone's rights in the name of someone else's utility. The self-assertive shrillness of protest arises because the facts of incommensurability ensure that protesters can never win an argument. The indignant self-righteousness of protest arises because the facts of incommensurability ensure equally that the protesters can never lose an argument either. Hence, the utterance of protest is characteristically addressed to those who already share the protester's premises. The effects of incommensurability ensure that protesters rarely have anyone else to talk to but themselves. This is not to say that protest cannot be effective. It is to say that it cannot be rationally effective, and that its dominant modes of expression give evidence of a certain, perhaps unconscious, awareness of this. The claim that the major protagonists of the distinctively modern moral causes of the modern world, I am not here speaking at all of those who seek to uphold older traditions, which have somehow or other survived into some sort of coexistence with modernity, offer a rhetoric which serves to conceal behind the masks of morality what are in fact the preferences of arbitrary will and desire, is not, of course, an original claim. For each of the contending protagonists of modernity, while for obvious reasons unwilling to concede that the claim is true in their own case, is prepared to make it about those against whom they contend. So the evangelicals of the Clapham sect saw in the morality of the Enlightenment a rational and rationalizing disguise for selfishness and sin. So in turn, the emancipated grandchildren of the evangelicals and the Victorian successors saw evangelical piety as mere hypocrisy. So later Bloomsbury, liberated by G.E. Moore, saw the whole semi-official cultural paraphernalia of the Victorian age as a pompous charade, concealing the arrogant self-will not only of fathers and clergymen, but also of Arnold, Ruskin, and Spencer. And so, in precisely the same way, D.H. Lawrence so-called saw through Bloomsbury. When emotivism was finally proclaimed as an entirely general thesis about the nature of moral utterance, it did no more than generalize what each party of cultural revolt in the modern world had already said about its particular moral predecessors. Unmasking the unacknowledged motives of arbitrary will and desire which sustain the moral masks of modernity is itself one of the most characteristically modern of activities. It was Freud's achievement to discover that unmasking arbitrariness in others may always be a defense against uncovering it in ourselves. At the beginning of the 20th century, autobiographies like Samuel Butler's clearly evoked an intense response from all who felt the oppressive weight of assertive paternal self-will behind the cultural forms in which they had been educated. And this oppressive weight was surely due to the extent to which educated men and women had internalized what they aspired to reject. Hence, the importance of Lytton Strachey's mockery of the Victorians as part of the liberation of Bloomsbury, and hence also the exaggerated rhetoric of Strachey's reaction to More's ethics. But even more important was Freud's presentation of the inherited conscience as superego, as an irrational part of ourselves whose commands we need, for the sake of our psychic health, to be freed from. Freud, of course, took himself to have made a discovery about morality as such, and not just about what morality had become in late 19th century and early 20th century Europe. But this mistake must not be allowed to detract from what he did achieve. It is worth at this point recalling the thread of my central argument. I began from the way in which contemporary moral debate is interminable, and I tried to explain that interminability as a consequence of the truth of an amended version of the emotivist theory of moral judgment, originally advanced by C.L. Stevenson and others. But I treated that theory not only as a philosophical analysis, but as a sociological hypothesis. I am unhappy about this way of putting the matter. It is not clear to me, for reasons which I gave in Chapter 3, how any adequate philosophical analysis in this area could escape being also a sociological hypothesis, and vice versa. There seems something deeply mistaken in the notion enforced by the conventional curriculum that there are two distinct subjects or disciplines, moral philosophy and a set of conceptual inquiry, moral philosophy, a set of conceptual inquiries on the one hand, and the sociology of morals, a set of empirical hypotheses and findings on the other. Quine's death blow to any substantial version of the analytic synthetic distinction casts doubt, in any case, on this kind of contrast between the conceptual and the empirical. My argument was thus to the effect that emotivism informs a great deal of contemporary moral utterance and practice, and more specifically, that the central characters of modern society, in the special sense which I assign to the word character, embody such emotivist modes in their behavior. These characters, it will be recalled, are the aesthete, the therapist, and the manager, that is, the bureaucratic expert. The historical discussion of those developments which made the victories of emotivism possible has now revealed something else about these specifically modern characters, namely, the extent to which they trade and cannot escape trading in moral fictions. But how far does the range of moral fictions extend beyond those of rights and utility, and who is going to be deceived by them? The aesthete is the character least likely to be their victim. Those insolent scoundrels of the philosophical imagination, Diderot's Rameau and Kierkegaard's A, who lounge so insolently at the entrance to the modern world, specialize in seeing through illusory and fictitious claims. If they are deceived, it is only by their own cynicism. When aesthetic deception occurs in the modern world, it is rather because of the reluctance of the aesthete to admit that it is what he is. So great can the burden of enjoying oneself become, so clearly can the emptiness and boredom of pleasure appear as a threat, that the aesthete sometimes has to resort to even more elaborate devices than were available to the younger Remu or to A. He may even become an addicted reader of Kierkegaard, and make of that despair which Kierkegaard saw as the aesthete's fate a new form of self-indulgence. And if overindulgence in despair seems to be injuring his capacities for enjoyment, he will take himself to the therapist, just as he would for overindulgence in alcohol, and make of his therapy one more aesthetic experience. The therapist, by contrast, is not only the most liable of the three typical characters of modernity to be deceived, but is also the most liable to be seen to be deceived, and not only by moral fictions. Devastating hostile critiques of the standard therapeutic theories of our culture are easily available. Indeed, each school of therapists is all too anxious to make clear the theoretical defects of each rival school. Thus, the problem is not why the claims of psychoanalytic or behavioral therapies are not exposed as ill-founded. It is rather why, since they have been so adequately undermined, the practices of therapy continue for the most part as though nothing had happened. And this problem, like that of the aesthete, is not only or merely a problem of moral fictions. Of course, both aesthete and therapist are doubtless as liable as anyone else to trade in such fictions, but they have no fictions which are peculiarly their own, which belong to the very definition of their role. With the manager, that dominant figure of the contemporary scene, it is quite otherwise. For besides rights and utility, among the central moral fictions of the age, we have to place the peculiarly managerial fiction embodied in the claim to possess systematic effectiveness in controlling certain aspects of social reality. And this thesis may at first seem surprising for two quite different kinds of reasons. We are not accustomed to doubt the effectiveness of managers in achieving what they set out to achieve, and we are equally unaccustomed to think of effectiveness as a distinctively moral concept, to be classed with such concepts as those of rights or of utility. Managers themselves, and most writers about management, conceive of themselves as morally neutral characters whose skills enable them to devise the most efficient means of achieving whatever end is proposed. Whether a given manager is effective or not is, on the dominant view, a quite different question from that of the morality of the ends which his effectiveness serves or fails to serve. Nonetheless, there are strong grounds for rejecting the claim that effectiveness is a morally neutral value, for the whole concept of effectiveness is, as I noticed earlier, inseparable from a mode of human existence in which the contrivances of means is in central part the manipulation of human beings into compliant patterns of behavior, and it is by appeal to his own effectiveness in this respect that the manager claims authority within the manipulative mode. Thus, effectiveness is a defining and definitive element of a way of life which competes for our allegiance with other alternative contemporary ways of life. And if we are to evaluate the claims of the bureaucratic managerial mode to a place of authority in our lives, an assessment of the bureaucratic managerial claim to effectiveness will be an essential task. The concept of effectiveness, as it is embodied in the utterances and practices of managerial roles and character, is of course an extremely general concept. It is bound up with equally general notions of social control exercised downwards in corporations, government agencies, trade unions, and a variety of other bodies. Egon Bittner, some years ago, identified a crucial gap between this generalized conception and any actual criteria which are precise enough to be usable in particular situations. While Weber is quite clear, he noted, In stating that the sole justification of bureaucracy is its efficiency, he provides us with no clear-cut guide on how this standard of judgment is to be used. Indeed, the inventory of features of bureaucracy contains not one single item that is not arguable relative to its efficiency function. Long-range goals cannot be used definitively for calculating it, because the impact of contingent factors multiplies with time and makes it increasingly difficult to assign a determinate value to the efficiency of a stably controlled segment of action. On the other hand, the use of short-term goals in judging efficiency may be in conflict with the ideal of economy itself. Not only do short-term goals change with time and compete with one another in indeterminate ways, but short-term results are of notoriously deceptive value because they can be easily manipulated to show whatever one wishes them to show. Bittner, 1965, page 247. It is the gap between the generalized notion of effectiveness and the actual behavior that is open to managers which suggests that the social uses of the notion are other than they purport to be. That the notion is used to sustain and extend the authority and power of managers is not, of course, in question, but it is used in connection with those tasks. But its use in connection with those tasks derives from the belief that managerial authority and power are justified because managers possess an ability to put skills and knowledge to work in the service of achieving certain ends. But what if effectiveness is part of a masquerade of social control rather than a reality? What if effectiveness were a quality widely imputed to managers and bureaucrats both by themselves and others, but in fact a quality which rarely exists apart from this imputation? The word that I shall borrow to name this alleged quality of effectiveness is expertise. I am not, of course, questioning the existence of genuine experts in many areas: the biochemistry of insulin, historical scholarship, the study of antique furniture. It is specifically and only managerial and bureaucratic expertise that I am going to put in question. And the conclusion to which I shall finally move is that such expertise does indeed turn out to be one more moral fiction, because the kind of knowledge which would be required to sustain it does not exist. But what would it be like if social control were indeed a masquerade? Consider the following possibility, that is, that what we are oppressed by is not power, but impotence. That one key reason why the presidents of large corporations do not, as some radical critics believe, control the United States, is that they do not even succeed in controlling their own corporations. That all too often, when imputed organizational skill and power are deployed and the desired effect follows, all that we have witnessed is the same kind of sequence as to be observed when a clergyman is fortunate enough to pray for rain just before the unpredicted end of a drought. That the levers of power, one of managerial expertise's own key metaphors, produce effects unsystematically and too often only coincidentally related to the effects of which their users boast. Were all this to be the case, it would of course be socially and politically important to disguise the fact, and deploying the concept of managerial effectiveness, as both managers and writers about management do deploy it, would be an essential part of any such disguise. Fortunately, I do not need to establish as part of the present argument precisely what it is that is being disguised in order to show that the concept of managerial effectiveness functions as a moral fiction. All that I need to show is that its use presupposes knowledge claims which cannot be made good, and further, that the difference between the uses to which it is put and the meaning of the assertions which embody it is precisely similar to that identified by the emotive theory in the case of other modern moral concepts. The mention of emotivism is very much to the point, for the thesis which I am presenting about belief in managerial effectiveness parallels to some degree the thesis advanced by certain emotivist moral philosophers, Carnap and Eyre, about belief in God. Carnap and Eyre both extended the emotive theory beyond the realm of moral judgment and argued that metaphysical assertions more generally, and religious assertions more particularly, while they purport to give information about a transcendent reality, actually do no more than express the feelings and attitudes of those who utter them. They disguise certain psychological realities with religious utterances. Carnap and Eyre thus open up the possibility of providing a sociological explanation for the prevalence of these illusions, although they themselves do not aspire to furnish one. I am suggesting that managerial effectiveness functions much as Carnap and Eyre supposed God to function. It is the name of a fictitious but believed-in reality, appeal to which disguises certain other realities. Its effective use is expressive, and just as Carnap and Eyre reached their conclusions principally by considering what they claimed was the lack of the appropriate kind of rational justification for belief in God, so the core of my argument is that the contention that interpretations of managerial effectiveness in the same way lack the appropriate kind of rational justification. If I am right in this, the characterization of the contemporary moral scene will have been taken one stage further than my previous argument took it. Not only will we be justified in concluding that an emotivist account is both true of and embodied in a very great deal of our moral utterances and practice, and that much of that utterance and practice is a trading in moral fictions, such as those of utility and rights. But we shall also have to conclude that another moral fiction, and perhaps the most culturally powerful of them all, is embodied in the claims to effectiveness and hence to authority made by that central character of the modern social drama, the bureaucratic manager. To a disturbing extent, our morality will be disclosed as a theater of illusions. The claim that the manager makes to effectiveness rests, of course, on the further claim to possess a stock of knowledge by means of which organizations and social structures can be molded. Such knowledge would have to include a set of factual, law-like generalizations which would enable the manager to predict that, if an event or state of affairs of a certain type were to occur or to be brought about, some other event or state of affairs of some specific kind would result. For only such law-like generalizations could yield those particular causal explanations and predictions by means of which the manager could mold, influence, and control the social environment. There are thus two parts to the manager's claim to justified authority. One concerns the existence of a domain of morally neutral fact about which the manager is to be expert. The other concerns the law-like generalizations and their applications to particular cases derived from the study of this domain. Both claims mirror claims made by the natural sciences, and it is not surprising that expressions such as management science should be coined. The manager's claim to moral neutrality, which is itself an important part of the way the manager presents himself and functions in the social and moral world, is thus parallel to the claims to moral neutrality made by many physical scientists. What it amounts to can best be understood by beginning from a consideration of how the relevant notion of the term fact first became socially available and was put to use by the 17th and 18th century intellectual ancestors of the bureaucratic manager. It will turn out to be the case that this history is related in an important way to the history which I have already recounted of how the concept of the autonomous moral subject emerged in moral philosophy. That emergence involved a rejection of all those Aristotelian and quasi-Aristotelian views of the world in which teleological perspective provided a context in which evaluative claims functioned as a particular kind of factual claim. And with that rejection, the concepts both of value and of fact acquired a new character. It is thus not a timeless truth that moral or otherwise evaluative conclusions cannot be entailed by factual premises, but it is true that the meaning assigned to moral and indeed to other key evaluative expressions so changed during the late 17th and 18th centuries that what are by then commonly allowed to be factual premises cannot entail what are by then commonly taken to be evaluative or moral conclusions. The historical enactment of this apparent division between fact and value was not, however, merely a matter of the way in which value and morality came to be reconceived. It was also reinforced by a changed and changing conception of fact, a conception whose examination has to precede any assessment of the modern manager's claim to possession of the kind of knowledge which would justify his authority. Chapter 7. The term fact, explanation, and expertise. The term fact is in modern culture a folk concept with an aristocratic ancestry. When Lord Chancellor Bacon, as part of the propaganda for his astonishing and idiosyncratic amalgam of past Platonism and future empiricism, enjoined his followers to abjure speculation and collect facts, he was immediately understood by such as John Aubrey to have identified facts as collector's items, to be gathered in with the same kind of enthusiasm that at other times has informed the collection of Spode china or the numbers of railway engines. The other early members of the Royal Society recognized very clearly that, whatever Aubrey was doing, it was not natural science as the rest of them understood it, but they did not recognize that on the whole it was he rather than they who was being faithful to the letter of Bacon's inductivism. Aubrey's error was, of course, not only to suppose that the natural scientist is a kind of magpie, it was also to suppose that the observer can confront a fact face to face without any theoretical interpretation interposing itself. That this was an error, although a pernicious and long-lived one, is now largely agreed upon by philosophers of science. The 20th century observer looks into the night sky and sees stars and planets. Some early observers saw instead chinks in a sphere through which the light beyond could be observed. What each observer takes himself or herself to perceive is identified and has to be identified by theory-laden concepts. Perceivers without concepts, as Kant almost said, are blind. Empiricist philosophers have contended that the common to the modern and the medieval observer is that which each really sees or saw, prior to any theory and interpretation, namely many small light patches against a dark surface, and it is at the very least clear that what both saw can be so described. But if all our experience were to be characterized exclusively in terms of this bare sensory type of description, a type of description which it is certainly useful for a variety of purposes to resort to from time to time, we would be confronted not only with an uninterrupted but an uninterruptible world, with not merely a world not yet comprehended by theory, but with a world that never could be comprehended by theory, a world of textures, shapes, smells, sensations, sounds, and nothing more invites no questions and gives no grounds for furnishing any answers. The empiricist concept of experience was a cultural invention of the late 17th and 18th centuries. It is at first sight paradoxical that it should have arisen in the same culture in which natural science arose, for it was invented as a panacea for the epistemological crises of the 17th century. It was intended as a device to close the gap between seems and is, between appearance and reality. It was to close this gap by making every experiencing subject a closed realm. There is to be nothing beyond my experience for me to compare my experience with, so that the contrast between seems to me and is in fact can never be formulated. This requires an even more radical kind of privacy for experience than is possessed by such genuinely private objects as after-images. For after-images can be misdescribed. Subjects in psychological experiments concerning them have to learn to report them accurately. The distinction between seems and is does indeed apply to real private objects such as these, but not to the invented private objects of empiricism, even though it is in terms of real private objects, after-images, hallucinations, dreams, that some empiricists try to explain their invented notion. It is scarcely surprising that empiricists had to press old words into new forms of service. The term idea, the term impression, and even the term experience itself. By the term experience was originally meant the act of putting something to test or trial, a meaning that was later reserved to the term experiment, and later still involvement in some form of activity, as when we speak of, quote, 5 years' experience as a carpenter. The empiricist concept of experience was unknown for most of human history. It is understandable, then, that empiricism's linguistic history is one of continuous innovation and invention, culminating in the barbarous neologism sense datum. By contrast, the natural scientific concepts of observation and experiment were intended to enlarge the distance between seems and is. The lenses of the telescope and the microscope are given priority over the lenses of the eye. In the measurement of temperature, the effect of heat on spirits of alcohol or mercury is given priority over the effect of heat on sunburnt skin or parched throats. Natural science teaches us to attend to some experiences rather than to others, and only to those when they have been cast into the proper form for scientific attention. It redraws the lines between seems and is. It creates new forms of distinction between both appearance and reality, and illusion and reality. The meaning of the term experiment and the meaning of the term experience diverge more sharply than they had done for the 17th century. There are, of course, other crucial divergences. The empiricist concept was intended to discriminate the basic elements from which our knowledge is constructed and on which it is founded. Beliefs and theories are to be vindicated or not depending on the verdict of the basic elements of experience. But the observations of the natural scientist are never, in this sense, basic. We do indeed bring hypotheses to the test of observation, but our observations in turn can always be put to the question. The belief that Jupiter has 7 moons is put to the test of observation through a telescope, but the observation itself has to be vindicated by the theories of geometrical optics. The theory is required to support observation, just as much as observation theory. There is indeed, therefore, something extraordinary in the coexistence of empiricism and natural science in the same culture, for they represent radically different and incompatible ways of approaching the world. But in the 18th century, both could be incorporated and expressed within one and the same worldview. It follows that the worldview is at its best radically incoherent. That keen and cold-eyed observer, Lawrence Sterne, drew the conclusion that philosophy, albeit unwittingly, had at last represented the world as a series of jokes, and out of these jokes he made the novel Tristram Shandy. What obscured the incoherence of their worldview for those about whom Sterne joked was, in part, the extent of their agreement on what was to be denied and excluded from their view of the world. What they agreed in denying and excluded from their view of the world, what they agreed in denying and excluding was in large part all of those aspects of the classical view of the world which were Aristotelian. From the 17th century onwards, it was a commonplace that whereas the scholastics had allowed themselves to be deceived about the character of the facts of the natural and social world by interposing an Aristotelian interpretation between themselves and experienced reality, we moderns, that is, we 17th century and 18th century moderns, had stripped away interpretation and theory and confronted fact and experience just as they are. It was precisely in virtue of this that those moderns proclaimed and named themselves the Enlightenment and understood the medieval past by contrast as the Dark Ages. What Aristotle obscured, they see. This conceit, of course, was, as such conceits always are, the sign of an unacknowledged and unrecognized transition from one stance of theoretical interpretation to another. The Enlightenment is consequently the period par excellence in which most intellectuals lack self-knowledge. What were the most important components in the 17th and 18th century transition in which the blind acclaim their own vision? For the Middle Ages, mechanisms were efficient causes in a world to be comprehended ultimately in terms of final causes. Every species has a natural end, and to explain the movements of and changes in an individual is to explain how that individual moves towards the end appropriate to members of that particular species. The ends to which men as members of such a species move are conceived by them as goods, and their movement towards or away from various goods are to be explained with reference to the virtues and vices which they have learned or failed to learn, and the forms of practical reasoning which they employ. Aristotle's Ethics and Politics, together of course with the De Anima, are as much treatises concerned with how human action is to be explained and understood as with what acts are to be done. Indeed, within the Aristotelian framework, the one task cannot be discharged without discharging the other. The modern contrast between the sphere of morality on the one hand and the sphere of the human sciences on the other is quite alien to Aristotelianism because, as we have already seen, the modern fact-value distinction is also alien to it. When, in the 17th and 18th centuries, the Aristotelian understanding of nature was repudiated, at the same time as Aristotle's influence had been expelled from both Protestant and Jansenist theology, the Aristotelian account of action was also rejected. The term man ceases, except within theology, and not always there, to be what I called earlier a functional concept. The explanation of action is increasingly held to be a matter of laying bare the psychological and physical mechanisms which underlie action, and when Kant recognizes that there is a deep incompatibility between any account of action which recognizes the role of moral imperatives in governing action and any such mechanical type of explanation, he is compelled to the conclusion that actions obeying and embodying moral imperatives must be from the standpoint of science inexplicable, and unintelligible. After Kant, the question of the relationship between such notions as those of intention, purpose, reason for action, and the like on the one hand, and the concepts which specify the notion of mechanical explanation on the other, becomes part of the permanent repertoire of philosophy. The former notions are, however, now treated as detached from notions of good or virtue. Those concepts have been handed over to the separate subdiscipline of ethics. Thus, the disjunctions and divorces of the 18th century perpetuate and reinforce themselves in contemporary circular divisions. But what is it to try to understand human action in mechanical terms, in terms that is of antecedent conditions as efficient in terms that is of antecedent conditions understood as efficient causes? In the 17th and 18th century, understanding of the matter, and in many subsequent versions, at the core of the notion of mechanical explanation is a conception of invariancies specified by law-like generalizations. To cite a cause is to cite a necessary condition or a sufficient condition, or a necessary and sufficient condition as the antecedent of whatever behavior is to be explained. So every mechanical causal sequence exemplifies some universal generalization, and that generalization has a precisely specifiable scope. Newton's laws of motion, which purport to be universal in scope, provide the paradigm case of such a set of generalizations. Being universal, they extend beyond what has actually been observed in the present or the past to what has escaped observation and to what has not yet been observed. If we know such a generalization to be true, we know not only that, for example, the hitherto observed planets do all obey Kepler's second law, but that if there were to be some planet other than those hitherto observed, it would also obey that law. If we know the truth of a statement expressing a genuine law, that is, we also know the truth of a set of well-defined counterfactual conditionals. This ideal of mechanical explanation was transferred from physics to the understanding of human behavior by a number of English and French thinkers in the 17th and 18th centuries, who differed a good deal among themselves over the details of their enterprise. And it was only somewhat later that the precise requirements of such an enterprise would have to be the precise requirements that such an enterprise would have to meet could be spelled out. One such requirement, and a very important one, was identified only in our own time by W.V. Quine, 1960, Chapter 6. Quine argued that if there is to be a science of human behavior whose key expressions characterize that behavior in terms precise enough to provide us with genuine laws, those expressions must be formulated in a vocabulary which omits all reference to intentions, purposes, and reasons for action. Just as physics, to become a genuine mechanical science, had to purify its descriptive vocabulary, so must the human sciences. What is it about intentions, purposes, and reasons that makes them thus unmentionable? It is the fact that all these expressions refer to or presuppose reference to the beliefs of the agents in question. The discourse which we use to speak about beliefs has two great disadvantages from the point of view of what Quine takes to be a science. First, sentences of the form, X believes that P, or for that matter, X enjoys its being the case that P, or X fears that P, have an internal complexity which is not truth-functional, which is to say, they cannot be mapped on the predicate calculus, and in this they differ in a crucial respect from the sentences used to express the laws of physics. Secondly, the concept of a state or belief or enjoyment or fear involves too many contestable and doubtful cases to furnish the kind of evidence we need to confirm or disconfirm claims to have discovered a law. Quine's conclusion is that therefore any genuine science of human behavior must eliminate such intentional expressions, but it is perhaps necessary to do to Quine what Marx did to Hegel, that is, to stand his argument on its head. For it follows from Quine's position that if it proved impossible to eliminate references to such items as belief and enjoyments and fears from our understanding of human behavior, that understanding could not take the form which Quine considers the form of human science, namely embodiment in law-like generalizations. An Aristotelian account of what is involved in understanding human behavior involves an ineliminable reference to such items, and hence it is not surprising that any attempt to understand human behavior in terms of mechanical explanation must conflict with Aristotelianism. The notion of fact with respect to human beings is thus transformed in the transition from Aristotelian to the mechanist view. On the former view, human action, because it is to be explained teleologically, not only can, but must be characterized with reference to the hierarchy of goods which provide the ends of human action. On the latter view, human action not only can, but must be characterized without any reference to such goods. On the former view, the facts about human action include the facts about what is valuable to human beings, and not just the facts about what they think to be valuable. On the latter view, there are no facts about what is valuable. The term fact becomes value-free. The term is becomes a stranger to the term ought. An explanation, as well as evaluation, changes its character as a result of this divorce between the term is and the term ought. Another implication of this transition was noted somewhat earlier by Marx in the third of his theses on Feuerbach. It is clear that the Enlightenment's mechanistic account of human action included both a thesis about the predictability of human behavior and a thesis about the appropriate ways to manipulate human behavior. As an observer, if I know the relevant laws governing the behavior of others, I can, whenever I observe the antecedent conditions have been fulfilled, predict the outcome. As an agent, if I know these laws, I can, whenever I can contrive the fulfillment of the same antecedent conditions, produce the outcome. What Marx understood was that such an agent is forced to regard his own actions quite differently from the behavior of those whom he is manipulating. For the behavior of the manipulated is being contrived in accordance with his intentions, reasons, and purposes. Intentions, reasons, and purposes which he is treating, at least while he is engaged in such manipulation, as exempt from the laws which govern the behavior of the manipulated. To them he stands at least for the moment as the chemist does to the samples of potassium chloride and sodium nitrate with which he experiments. But in the chemical changes which the chemist or the technologist of human behavior brings about, the chemist or the technologist must see exemplified not only the laws which govern such changes, but the imprinting of his own will on nature or society. And that imprinting he will treat, as Marx saw, as the expression of his own rational autonomy and not the mere outcome of antecedent conditions. Of course, the question remains open, whether in the case of the agent who claims to be applying the signs of human behavior, we are genuinely observing the application of real technology, or rather instead the deceptive and self-deceptive historic mimicry of such a technology. Which it is depends upon whether we believe that the mechanistic program for social science has or has not in fact been substantially achieved. And in the 18th century at least, the notion of a mechanistic science of man remained the program and prophecy. But prophecies in this area may be translated not into real achievement, but into a social performance which disguises itself as such achievement. And this, as the argument which I develop in the next chapter will show, is what in fact happened. The history of how intellectual prophecy became social performance is of course a complex one. It begins quite independently of the development of the concept of manipulative expertise with the story of how the modern state acquired its civil servants, a story that is not the same for Prussia as for France, and England differs yet again from both, and the United States from all three. But as the functions of modern states became more and more the same, their civil services came to be more and more the same too, and while their various political masters come and go, civil servants maintain the administrative continuity of government and thus confer on the government much of its character. The civil servant has his 19th century counterparts and opposite the social reformer. St. Simeonus, Comentians, utilitarians, English ameliorists such as Charles Booth, the early Fabian socialists. Their characteristic lament is as follows: if only government could learn to be scientific, and the long-term response of government is to claim that it has indeed become scientific in just the sense that the reformers required. Government insists more and more that its civil servants themselves have the kind of education that will qualify them as experts. It more and more recruits those who claim to be experts into its civil service, and it characteristically recruits, too, the heirs of the 19th century reformers. Government itself becomes a hierarchy of bureaucratic managers, and the major justification advanced for the intervention of government in society is the contention that government has resources of competence which most citizens do not possess. Private corporations similarly justify their activities by referring to their possession of similar resources of competence. Expertise becomes a commodity for which rival state agencies and rival private corporations compete. Civil servants and managers alike justify themselves and their claims to authority, power, and money by invoking their own competence as scientific managers of social change. Thus there emerges an ideology which finds its classical form of expression in a pre-existing sociological theory, Weber's theory of bureaucracy. Weber's theory of bureaucracy notoriously has many flaws, but in his insistence that the rationality of adjudicating means to ends in the most economical and efficient way is the central task of the bureaucrat, and that therefore the appropriate mode of justification of his activity by the bureaucrat lies in the appeal to his, or later her, ability to deploy a body of scientific and above all social scientific knowledge organized in terms of and understood as comprising a set of universal law-like generalizations, Weber provided the key to much of the modern age. I argued in Chapter 3 that modern theories of bureaucracy or of administration, which differ widely from Weber's at many other points, tend on this issue of managerial justification to agree with him, and that this consensus suggests strongly that what the books written by modern organization theorists describe is genuinely a part of modern managerial practice. So we can now see, in bare skeletal outline, a progress first from the Enlightenment's ideal for a social science to the aspirations of social reformers, next from the aspirations of social reformers to the ideals of practice and justification of civil servants and managers, then from the practices of management to the theoretical codification of these practices and of the norms governing them by sociologists and organization theorists, and finally from the employment of the textbooks written by those theorists in schools of management and business schools to the theoretically informed managerial practice of the contemporary technocratic expert. If this history were to be written out in all its concise detail, it would of course not be the same in each advanced country. The sequences would not be quite the same. The role of the Grand École is not precisely the same as either that of the London School of Economics or of the Harvard Business School, and the German civil servant's intellectual and institutional ancestry is notably different from that of some of his other European counterparts. But in every case, the rise of managerial expertise would have to be the same central theme, and such expertise, as we have already seen, has two sides to it. That is, there is the aspiration to value neutrality and the claim to manipulative power. Both of these, we can now perceive, derive from the history of the way in which the realm of fact and the realm of value were distinguished by the philosophers of the 17th and 18th century. 20th century social life turns out in key part to be the concrete and dynamic reenactment of 18th century philosophy, and the legitimation of the characteristic institutional forms of 20th century social life depends upon a belief that some of the central claims of that earlier philosophy have been vindicated. But is this true? Do we now possess that set of law-like generalizations governing social behavior of the possession of which Diderot and Concordet dreamed? Are our bureaucratic rulers thereby justified or not? It has not been sufficiently remarked that how we ought to answer the question of the moral and political legitimacy of the characteristically dominant institutions of modernity turns on how we decide an issue in the philosophy of the social sciences. Chapter 8. The character of generalizations in social science and their lack of predictive power. What managerial expertise requires for its vindication is a justified conception of social science as providing a stock of law-like generalizations with strong predictive power. It might therefore seem, at first sight, that the claims of managerial expertise can be easily sustained. For just this conception of social science has dominated the philosophy of social science for 200 years. According to this conventional account, from the Enlightenment through Comte and Mill To Hempel, the aim of the social sciences is to explain specifically social phenomena by supplying law-like generalizations which do not differ in their logical form from those applicable to natural phenomena in general, precisely the kind of law-like generalizations to which the managerial expert would have to appeal. This account, however, seems to entail, what is certainly not the case, that the social sciences are almost or perhaps completely devoid of achievement. For the salient fact about those social sciences is the absence of the discovery of any law-like generalizations whatsoever. It is of course true that the claim is occasionally made that at last a true law governing human behavior has been discovered. The only problem is that the alleged laws, the Phillips curve in economics, for instance, or C.G. Hoffman's, if the interactions between the members of a group are frequent in the external system, sentiments of liking will grow up between them, and these sentiments will in turn lead to further interaction over and above the interactions of the external system, all turn out to be false. And as Stanislav Zandrewski has trenchantly pointed out in the case of Hoffman's formulation, so unquestionably false that no one but a professional social scientist dominated by the conventional philosophy of science would ever have been tempted to believe them. Given, then, that conventional philosophy of social science has asserted that the task of the social scientist is the production of law-like generalizations, and given further that social science does not produce generalizations of this kind, one might have expected a hostile and dismissive attitude on the part of many social scientists to the conventional philosophy of social science. Yet, this has certainly not occurred, and I have identified one good reason for not being too surprised at this. It is, of course, that if social science does not present its findings in the form of law-like generalizations, the grounds for employing social scientists as expert advisors to government or to private corporations become unclear, and the very notion of managerial expertise is imperiled. For the central function of the social scientist as expert advisor or manager is to predict the outcomes of alternative policies, and if his predictions do not derive from a knowledge of law-like generalizations, the status of the social scientist as predictor becomes endangered, as, so it turns out, it ought to be. For the record of social scientists as predictors is very bad indeed, insofar as the record can be pieced together. No economist predicted stagflation before it occurred. The writings of monetary theorists have singly failed to predict the rates of inflation correctly, and D.J.C. Smythe and J.C.K. Ash have shown that the forecasts produced on the basis of the most sophisticated economic theory for OECD since 1967 have produced less successful predictions than would have been arrived at by using the common sense, or as they say, naive methods of forecasting rates of growth by taking the average rate of growth for the last 10 years as a guide, or rates of inflation by assuming that the next 6 months will resemble the last 6 months. Smythe and Ash, 1975. One could go on multiplying examples of the predictive ineptitude of economists, and with demography the situation has been even worse. But this would be grossly unfair, for economists and demographers have at least gone on record with their predictions in systematic fashion. But most sociologists and political scientists keep no systematic records of their predictions, and those futurologists who scatter predictions lavishly around rarely, if ever, avert to their predictive failures afterward. Indeed, in the notorious article by Carl Deutsch, John Platt, and Dieger Senghors in Science, March 1971, where 62 alleged major social science achievements are listed, it is impressive that in not a single case is the predictive power of the theories listed assessed in statistical terms, a wise precaution since given the authors' point of view. That the social sciences are predictively weak and that they do not discover law-like generalizations may clearly turn out to be two symptoms of the same condition. But what is that condition? Ought we simply to conclude that predictive weakness reinforces the conclusion implied by the conjunction of the conventional philosophy of social science and the facts about what social scientists do and do not achieve, namely, that the social sciences have substantially failed at their task? Or ought we perhaps instead to question both the conventional philosophy of social science and the claim to expertise by social scientists who seek to hire themselves out to government and corporations? What I am suggesting is that the true achievements of the social sciences are being concealed from us, and from many social scientists themselves, by systematic misinterpretation. Consider, for example, 4 highly interesting generalizations that have been advanced by modern social scientists. The first is James C. Davies' famous thesis in 1962, which generalizes to revolutions as a class Tocqueville's observation that the French Revolution occurred when a period of rising and, to some degree, gratified expectations was followed by a period of setback when expectations continued to rise and were sharply disappointed. The second is Oscar Newman's generalization that the crime rate rises in high-rise buildings when the height of the building The second is Oscar Newman's generalization that the crime rate rises in high-rise buildings with the height of the building up to a height of 13 floors, but at more than 13 floors levels off. Newman, 1973, page 25. The third is Egon Bitter's discovery of the difference between the understanding of the import of law embodied in police work and the understanding of that same import embodied in the practice of courts and lawyers. Bittner, 1970. The fourth is the contention advanced by Rosalind and Ivo Feyerabend, 1966, that the most and least modernized societies are the most stable and least violent, whereas those at the midpoint in the approach to modernity are most liable to instability and political violence. All 4 of these generalizations rest on distinguished research. All are buttressed by an impressive set of confirming instances, but they all share 3 notable characteristics. First of all, they all coexist in their disciplines with recognized counterexamples, and the recognition of these counterexamples, if not by the authors of the generalizations themselves, at least by colleagues at work in the same areas, does not seem to affect the standing of the generalizations in anything like the way in which it would affect the standing of generalizations in physics or chemistry. Some critics from outside the social scientific disciplines, the historian Walter Lacour, for example, in 1972, have treated these counterexamples as affording reasons for dismissing both such generalizations, and the disciplines that are so lax as to allow generalizations and counterexamples to coexist. So Lacour has cited the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the Chinese of 1949 as examples refuting Davies' generalization and the patterns of political violence in Latin America as refuting Feyerabend's claim. For the moment, all I want to note is that social scientists themselves characteristically and for the most part do in fact adopt just such a tolerant attitude to counterexamples, an attitude very different from that of either natural scientists themselves or of Popperian philosophers of science, and to leave open the question of whether their attitude might not, after all, be justified. A second characteristic, closely linked to the first of all 4 generalizations, is they lack not only universal quantifiers, but also scope modifiers. That is, they are not only genuinely of the form for all x and some y, if x has property phi, then y has property theta. But we cannot say of them in any precise way under what conditions they hold. Of the gas law equations relating pressure, temperature, and volume, we know not only that they hold of all gases, but the original formulation whereby they were held to hold under all conditions has since been revised to modify their scope. We now know that they hold for all gases under conditions except those of very low temperatures and very high pressure, where we can say exactly what we mean by the term very high and the term very low. none of our 4 social scientific generalizations is presented with such clauses attached. Thirdly, these generalizations do not entail any well-defined set of counterfactual conditionals in the way that the law-like generalizations of physics and chemistry do. We do not know how to apply them systematically beyond the limits of observation to unobserved or hypothetical instances. Thus they are not laws, whatever else they may be. What then is their status? To respond to this question is not going to be easy, because we do not possess any philosophical account of them which respects them for what they are, rather than treating them as failed attempts at the formulation of laws. Some social scientists, it is true, have seen no problem here. Confronted with the kind of consideration which I have adduced, they have thought it appropriate to reply, "What the social scientists discover are probabilistic generalizations, and where a generalization is only probabilistic, of course, there can be no cases which would be counterexamples if the generalization was non-probabilistic and universal." But this reply misses the point completely. For if the type of generalization which I have cited is to be a generalization at all, it must be something more than a mere list of instances. The probabilistic generalizations of natural science, those, say, of statistical mechanics, are indeed more than this precisely because they are as law-like as any non-probabilistic generalizations. They possess universal quantifiers. Quantification is over sets, not over individuals. They entail well-defined sets of counterfactual conditionals, and they are refuted by counterexamples in precisely the same way and to the same degree that other law-like generalizations are. Hence, we throw no light on the status of the characteristic generalization of the social sciences by calling them probabilistic, for they are as different from the generalizations of statistical mechanics as they are from the generalizations of Newtonian mechanics or of the gas law equations. We therefore have to start out afresh, and in so doing to consider whether the social sciences may not have looked in the wrong place for their philosophical ancestry as well as for their logical structure. It is because modern social scientists have seen themselves as the successors of Comte and Mill and Buckle, of Helvetius and Diderot and Concord-Essay, that they have presented their writings as attempted answers to the questions of their 18th and 19th century masters. But let us suppose once again that the 18th and 19th centuries, brilliant and creative as they were in fact centuries not as we and they take them to be of enlightenment, but of a peculiar kind of darkness, in which men so dazzled themselves that they could no longer see and ask whether the social sciences might not have an alternative ancestry. The name I wish to invoke is that of Machiavelli. For Machiavelli takes a very different view of the relationship between explanation and prediction from that taken by the Enlightenment. The thinkers of the Enlightenment were infant Hempelians. To explain is, on their view, to invoke a law-like generalization retrospectively. To predict is to invoke a similar generalization prospectively. For this tradition, the diminution of predictive failure is the mark of a progress of science, and those social scientists who have espoused it must face the fact that if they are right at some point, an unprecedented war or revolution will become as disgraceful for a political scientist as an unpredicted change in the rate of inflation, as disgraceful for an economist, as would an unpredicted eclipse for an astronomer. That this has not occurred yet has itself to be explained within this tradition, and explanations have not been lacking. That is, the human sciences are still young sciences, it is said, but clearly falsely. They are in fact as old as the natural sciences. Or it is said that the natural sciences attract the most able individuals in modern culture, and the social sciences only those not able to do natural science. This was the claim of H.T. Buckle in the 19th century, and there is some evidence that it is still partly true. A 1960 study of the IQs of those completing PhD requirements in various disciplines showed that natural scientists are significantly more intelligent than social scientists, although chemists drag down the natural science averages and economists raise the social science average. But the same reasons that make me... Sorry, that's funny to me. But the same reasons that make me reluctant to judge deprived minority children by their IQ scores make me equally reluctant to judge my colleagues by them, or myself. Yet perhaps explanations are not needed, for perhaps the failure to do that the dominant tradition tries to explain is like King Charles II's dead fish. Charles II once invited the members of the Royal Society to explain to him why a dead fish weighs more than the same fish alive. A number of subtle explanations were offered to him. He then pointed out that it does not, in fact, weigh more dead than alive. Wherein does Machiavelli differ from the Enlightenment tradition? Above all, in his concept of fortuna. Machiavelli certainly believed as passionately as any thinker of the Enlightenment that our investigations should issue in generalizations which may furnish maxims for enlightened practice. But he also believed that no matter how good a stock of generalizations one amassed, and no matter how well one reformulated them, the factor of fortuna was ineliminable from human life. Machiavelli also believed that we might be able to contrive a quantitative measure of fortuna's influence in human affairs. But this belief for the moment I shall set on one side. What I want to emphasize is Machiavelli's belief that, given the best possible stock of generalizations, we may on the day be defeated by an unpredicted and unpredictable counterexample, and yet still see no way to improve upon our generalizations and still have no reason to abandon them or even to reformulate them. We can, by improvements in our knowledge, limit the sovereignty of Fortuna, bitch goddess of unpredictability. We cannot dethrone her. If Machiavelli was right, the logical condition of the four generalizations which we inspected would be that which we could expect to hold for the most successful generalizations of the social sciences. It would in no way be a mark of failure. But was he right? I want to argue that there are four sources of systematic unpredictability in human affairs. The first arises from the nature of radical conceptual innovation. Sir Karl Popper suggested the following example. Sometime in the old Stone Age, you and I are discussing the future, and I predict that within the next 10 years, someone will invent the wheel. Wheel, you ask? What is that? I then describe the wheel to you, finding words doubtless with difficulty for the very first time to say what a rim, spokes, and hub, and perhaps an axle will be. Then I pause, aghast. But no one can be going to invent the wheel, for I have just invented it. In other words, the invention of the wheel cannot be predicted. For a necessary part of predicting an invention is to say what a wheel is, and to say what a wheel is just is to invent it. It is easy to see how this example can be generalized. Any invention, any discovery, which consists essentially in the elaboration of a radically new concept cannot be predicted, for a necessary part of the prediction is the present elaboration of the very concept whose discovery or invention was to take place only in the future. The notion of the prediction of radical conceptual innovation is itself conceptually incoherent. Why do I say radically new rather than just new? Consider the following objection to this thesis. Many inventions and discoveries have in fact been predicted, and these predictions have involved new concepts. Jules Verne predicted lighter-than-air flying machines, and so long before him did the anonymous author of the myth of Icarus. Whoever may have been the first predictor of human flight, it may be the thought that he or she certainly provides a counterexample to my thesis. In the face of this rejoinder, 2 points must be made. The first is that for anyone familiar with the concepts of a bird, or even a pterodactyl, and a machine, the concept of a flying machine involves no radical innovation. It is merely an additive construction from the existing stock of concepts, new if you like, but not radically new. By saying this, I hope that I make the point of saying radically new or radically innovative clear, and that I also make it clear that what was alleged to be a counterexample is not in fact one. The second point is, although Jules Verne may be said to have predicted the invention of aeroplanes or submarines, this is in the same sense of the word as those in which Mother Shipton, too, may be said to have predicted the invention of aeroplanes in the early 16th century. But my present thesis is concerned not with mere foretelling, but with rationally grounded prediction, and it is the systematic limitations on such prediction with which I am concerned. What is important about the systematic unpredictability of rational conceptual innovation is, of course, the consequent unpredictability of the future of science. Physicists are able to tell us a good deal about the future of nature in such areas as thermodynamics, but they are able to tell us nothing about the future of physics, insofar as that future involves radical conceptual innovation. Yet it is the future of physics which we need to know about if we are to know about the future of our own physics-based society. The conclusion that we cannot predict the future of physics is also supported by another argument independent of Popper's. Suppose that someone were to improve computing hardware and software so that it became possible to write a program which would enable a computer to predict, on the basis of information about the present state of mathematics, the past history of mathematics, and the talents and energy of present-day mathematicians, which well-formed formulas in a given branch of mathematics, algebraic typology, say, or number theory, for which at the present we possess neither a proof nor a proof of their negation, would receive such proof within 10 years. We are not requiring that the computer identify all such well-formed formulas, but only some of them. Such a program would have to embody a decision procedure whereby a subset of well-formed formulas, provable but not yet proven, were discriminated from the set of well-formed formulas. But Church has provided us with the strongest reasons for believing that for any calculus rich enough to express arithmetic, yet alone algebraic topology or number theory, there can be no such decision procedure. Hence, it is a truth of logic that no such computer program will ever be written, and more generally, therefore, it is a truth of logic that the future of mathematics is unpredictable. But if the future of mathematics is unpredictable, so is a great deal else. Consider just one example. It follows from the preceding argument that before Turing proved the theorem which underlies a good deal of modern computing science in the 1930s, its proof could not have been rationally predicted, unless we count Babbage as the precursor of Turing, but this would not affect the conceptual point. From this it follows that such subsequent scientific and technological work on computing machines, as depends on the possession of that proof, could not have been predicted either, but it is just that work which has shaped so many of our lives. It is of course worth noting that Popper's argument holds of any area in which radical conceptual innovation takes place, and not just natural science. What made the discoveries of quantum mechanics or special relativity unpredictable before they occurred also made unpredictable for precisely the same reasons the invention of the genre of tragedy at Athens in the late 6th century BC, or the first preaching of Luther's distinctive doctrine of justification fide sola, or the first elaboration of Kant's theory of knowledge. The striking implications for social life in general are clear. It is also clear that nothing in these arguments entails that discovery or radical innovation are inexplicable. Particular discoveries or innovations may always be explained after the event, although it is not entirely clear what such an explanation would be and whether there are any. Explanations of the incidence of discovery and innovation in particular periods are, however, not only possible, but for some type of discovery well established on the basis of work which goes back to Francis Galton. See De Sola Price, 1963, and this coexistence of unpredictability and explicability holds not just for the first type of systematic unpredictability, but for three others. The second type of systematic unpredictability, to which I now turn, is that which derives from the way in which the unpredictability of certain of his own future actions by each agent individually generates another element of unpredictability as such in the social world. It is at first sight a trivial truth that when I have not yet made up my mind which of two or more alternatives and mutually exclusive courses of actions to take, I cannot predict which I shall take. Decisions contemplated but not yet made by me entail unpredictability of me, by me, in the relevant areas. But this truth seems trivial, precisely because what I cannot predict of myself, others may well be able to predict about me. My own future, from my point of view, may be representable only as a set of ramifying alternatives, with each node in the branching system representing a point of as yet unmade decision-making. But from the point of view of an adequately informed observer, provided both with the relevant data about me and the relevant stock of generalizations concerning people of my type, my future, so it seems, may be representable as an entirely determinable set of stages. Yet a difficulty at once arises. For this observer, who is able to predict what I cannot, is of course unable to predict his own future in just the way that I am unable to predict mine, and one of the features which he will be unable to predict, since it depends in substantial part upon decisions as yet unmade by him, is how far his actions will impact upon and change the decisions made by others, both what alternatives they will choose and what sets of alternatives will be offered to them for choice. Now among those others is me. It follows that insofar as the observer cannot predict the impact of his future actions on my future decision-making, he cannot predict my future actions any more than he can his own. And this clearly holds for all agents and all observers. The unpredictability of my future by me does indeed generate an important degree of unpredictability as such. Someone, of course, might challenge one premise of my argument, what I described as the apparently trivial truth that where my future actions depend on the outcome of decisions as yet unmade by me, I cannot predict those actions. Consider a possible counterexample. I am a chess player, and so is my identical twin. I know from experience that in end games, given the same situation on the board, we always make the same moves. I am puzzling over whether to move my knight or my bishop in an endgame situation when someone says to me, "Yesterday your brother was in the same situation." I can now predict that I will make the same move that my brother made. So surely, here is a case of my being able to predict a future action of mine which depends upon an as yet unmade decision. But what is crucial is that I can only predict my action under the description the same move as that which my brother made yesterday, but not under either of the descriptions move the knight or move the bishop. What this counterexample leads to, therefore, is a reformulation of the premise, that is, I cannot predict my own future actions so far as these depend upon decisions as yet unmade by me, under the descriptions which characterize the alternatives defining the decision. And the premise thus reworded yields the corresponding conclusion about unpredictability as such. Another way of putting the same point would be to note that omniscience excludes the making of decisions. If God knows everything that will occur, he confronts no as yet unmade decision. He has a single will. Summa contra Gentiles, chapter 79. Quod Deus vult etiam equae nom dum sunt. It is precisely insofar as we differ from God that unpredictability invades our lives. This way of putting the point has one particular merit. That is, it suggests precisely what project those who seek to eliminate unpredictability from the social world, or to deny it, may in fact be engaging in. A third source of systematic unpredictability arises from the game-theoretic character of social life. To some theorists in political science, the formal structures of game theory have served to provide a possible basis for explanatory and predictive theory incorporating law-like generalizations. Take the formal structure of an n-person game, identify the relevant interests of the players in some empirical situation, and we shall at the very least be able to predict what alliances and coalitions a fully rational player will enter into and, at a perhaps utopian most, the pressures upon and the subsequent behaviors of not fully rational players. This recipe and its criticism have inspired some notable work, especially that of William H. Riker. But the large hope that it embodied in its original optimistic form seems to be illusory. Consider three types of obstacle to the transfer of the formal structures of game theory to the interpretation of actual social and political situations. The first concerns the indefinite reflexivity of game-theoretic situations. I am trying to predict what move you will make. In order to predict this, I must predict what you will predict as to what move I will make, and in order to predict this, I must predict what you will predict about what I will predict about what you will predict, and so on. At each stage, each of us will simultaneously be trying to render himself or herself unpredictable by the other, and each of us will also be relying on the knowledge that the other will be trying to make himself or herself unpredictable in forming his or her own predictions. Here, the formal structures of the situation can never be an adequate guide. A knowledge of them may be necessary, but even a knowledge of them backed by a knowledge of each player's interest cannot tell us what the simultaneous attempt to render others predictable and oneself unpredictable will produce. This first type of obstacle may not by itself be insuperable. The chances that it will be are, however, heightened by the existence of a second type of obstacle. Game-theoretic situations are characteristically situations of imperfect knowledge, and this is no accident, for it is a major interest of each actor to maximize the imperfection of the information of certain other actors at the same time as he improves his own. Moreover, a condition of success at misinforming other actors is likely to be the successful production of false impressions in external observers too. This leads to an interesting invention of Collingwood's odd thesis. This leads to an interesting inversion of Collingwood's odd thesis that we can only hope to understand the actions of the victorious and the successful, while those of the defeated must remain opaque to us. But if I am right, the conditions of success include the ability to deceive successfully, and hence it is the defeated whom we are more likely to be able to understand, and it is those who are going to be defeated whose behaviors we are more likely to be able to predict. Once again, this second type of obstacle need not be insuperable, even in conjunction with the first. But there is yet a third type of obstacle to prediction in game-theoretic situations. Consider the following familiar type of situation. The management of a major industry are negotiating the terms of the next long-term contract with the labor union leadership. Representatives of the government are present, not only in an arbitrating and mediating role, but because the government has a particular interest in the industry. Its products are crucial for defense, say, or it is an industry which powerfully affects the rest of the economy. At first sight, it ought to be easy to map this situation in game-theoretic terms, that is, 3 collective players, each with a distinctive interest. But now let us introduce some of those features that so often make social reality so messy and untidy in contrast with the neat examples of the textbooks. Some of the union leadership are approaching the time when they are going to retire from their posts in the union. If they cannot obtain relatively highly paid jobs with either the employers or the government, they may have to return to the shop floor. The employers are not only concerned with government in its present public interest capacity, they have a longer-term concern with obtaining a different type of government contract. One of the representatives of government is considering running for elected office in a district where the labor vote is crucial. That is to say, in any given social situation, it is frequently the case that many different transactions are taking place at one and the same time between members of the same group. Not one game is being played, but several. And, if the game metaphor may be stretched further, the problem about real life is that moving one's knight to QB3 may always be replied with a lob across the net. Even when we can identify with some certainty what game is being played, there's another problem. In real-life situations, unlike both games and the examples in books about game theory, we often do not start with a determinate set of players and pieces or determinate area in which the game is to take place. There is, or perhaps used to be, on the market a cardboard and plastic version of the Battle of Gettysburg, which reproduces with great accuracy the terrain, the chronology, and the units involved in that battle. It has this peculiarity that a moderately good player taking the Confederate side can win. Yet clearly no player of war games is likely to be as intelligent at generalship as Lee was, and he lost. Why? The answer, of course, is that the player knows from the outset what Lee did not, what the time scale of the preliminary stages of the battle must be, precisely what units are going to get involved, what the limits to the terrain are on which the battle is to be fought. And all this entails that the game does not reproduce Lee's situation. For Lee did not and could not know that it was the Battle of Gettysburg, an episode on which a determinate shape was to be conferred only retrospectively by its outcome, which was about to be fought. Failure to realize this affects the predictive power of many computer simulations which seek to transfer analyses of past determinative situations to the prediction of future indeterminate ones. Consider one example from the Vietnam War. Using Lewis F. Richardson's analysis in 1960 of the Anglo-German naval race in the years before 1914, Jeffrey S. Milstein and William Charles Mitchell in 1968 constructed a simulation of the Vietnam War which embodied some of Richardson's generalizations. Their predictions failed in two ways. First, they relied on official U.S. figures for their statistics about such matters as Viet Cong killings of civilians or numbers of Viet Cong defectors. Perhaps in 1968 they could not have known what we know now about the systematic falsification of numbers by the American military in Vietnam. But had they been sensitive in any way to that need of players to maximize the imperfection of information of which I wrote earlier, they would not have treated the confirming instances of their predictions so confidently. What is striking, however, is their response to the second source of failure, one which they do note themselves. Their predictions were radically upset by the Tet Offensive. The response of Milstein and Mitchell is to speculate as to how future studies might be extended so that the factors which led to the Tet Offensive might be included. What they ignore is the necessarily open and indeterminate character of all situations as complex as the Vietnam War. There is, at the outset, no determinate innumerable set of factors, the totality of which comprise the situation. Innumerable can be numbered set of factors. There is at the outset no determinate innumerable set of innumerable. There is at the outset no determinate innumerable set of factors, the totality of which comprise the situation. To suppose otherwise is to confuse a retrospective standpoint with a prospective one. To say this is not at all the same as saying that all computer simulation is valueless. But what simulation cannot evade are the systematic sources of unpredictability. I turn now to the fourth such source, that is, pure contingency. J.B. Bury once followed Pascal in suggesting that the cause of the foundation of the Roman Empire was the length of Cleopatra's nose. That is, had her features not been perfectly proportioned, Mark Antony would not have been entranced. Had he not been entranced, he would not have allied himself with Egypt against Octavian. Had he not made that alliance, the Battle of Actium would not have been fought, and so on. One does not need to accept Bury's argument to see that the trivial contingencies can powerfully influence the outcome of great events. That is, the molehill which killed Wilhelm III, or Napoleon's cold at Waterloo which led him to delegate command to Ney, who in turn had 4 horses shot from under him that day, which led to faults in judgment, most notably in sending in the Garde Imperiale 2 hours too late. There is no way in which all such contingencies as moles and bacteria provide can be allowed for in battle plans. We have then 4 independent but often related sources of systematic unpredictability in human life. It is important to emphasize that not only does unpredictability not entail inexplicability, but that its presence is compatible with the truth of determinism in a strong version. Suppose we are able at some future date, and I see no reason why this should not be so, to build and to program computers which are able to simulate wide ranges of human behavior. They are mobile, they acquire, exchange, and reflect upon information, they have competitive as well as cooperative goals, they make decisions between alternative courses of action. It is important to recognize that such computers would simultaneously be completely specified mechanical and electronic systems of a determinate kind, and yet would be liable to all 4 types of unpredictability. all of them would be unable to predict radical conceptual innovation or future proofs in mathematics for precisely the same reasons that we are unable to. All of them would be unable to predict the outcome of their own as yet unmade decisions. Each of them would be involved in its relations to other computers in the same types of game theoretic tangle which entrap us, and all of them would be vulnerable to external contingencies, that is, power failures, for example. Yet each particular movement and in each computer would be wholly explicable in mechanical or electronic terms. It follows that the description of their behavior at the level of activity in terms of decisions, relationships, goals, and the like would be very different in its logical and conceptual structures from the description of behavior at the level of electrical impulses. It would be difficult to give the notion of reducing the one mode of description to the other any clear sense, and if this is true of these imaginary but possible computers, it seems likely to be true of us too. It does indeed seem likely that we are these computers. It is at this point that someone may want to query the status of the whole argument so far. It may be suggested that there is an internal incoherence in my contentions. For on the one hand, I have asserted that we cannot predict radical conceptual innovation, while on the other, I have asserted that there are systematic and permanently unpredictable elements in human life. But surely the first of these assertions entails that I cannot know that tomorrow or next year some genius will not produce an innovative theory which will enable us to predict what will turn out to have been merely so far unpredictable, but not unpredictable as such. On my own terms, it may be argued, it must remain unpredictable by me whether the future will not turn out to be fully predictable after all, or the point may be put another way, that is, it may be asked, have you shown that certain matters are necessarily and in principle unpredictable, or merely that as a matter of contingent fact they are unpredictable? Now, certainly I have not claimed that the prediction of the human future is logically impossible in 3 of the 4 areas which I have picked out. And in the case of the argument which uses as a premise a corollary to Church's theorem, I have selected a premise in an area of some logical controversy, even though I believe it to be entirely soundly based. Am I then vulnerable to the charge that what is today unpredictable may tomorrow become predictable? I think not. In philosophy, there are in fact very few and perhaps no valid logical impossibility or reductio ad absurdum proofs. The reason for this is that to produce such a proof we need to be able to map the relevant parts of our discourse onto a formal calculus in such a way as to enable us to move from given formula Q to a consequence in the form of P, not P, and thence as a further consequence to not Q. But the kind of clarity that is required to formalize our discourse in this way is characteristically precisely what eludes us in areas where philosophical problems arise. Hence, what are treated as reductio ad absurdum proofs are often arguments of quite another kind. Wittgenstein, for example, has sometimes been interpreted as trying to offer a proof of the logical impossibility of a private language, conjoining an analysis of the notion of language as essentially teachable and public, and an account of the notion of inner states as essentially private, in order to show that a contradiction is involved of speaking of a private language. But such an interpretation misconstrues Wittgenstein, who, I take it, was saying to us something like this, that is, on the best account of language that I can give, and the best account of inner mental states that I can give, I can make nothing of the notion of a private language. I cannot render it adequately intelligible. Just this is my own response to the suggestion that perhaps some genius might render what is now unpredictable predictable. I have offered no proof to bar the way to this. I do not even view the introduction of Church's thesis into the argument as contributing to any such proof. It is just that, given the type of consideration which I have been able to adduce, I can make nothing of the proposal. I cannot render it adequately intelligible either to assert it or to dissent from it. Given, then, that there are unpredictable elements in social life, it is crucial to notice their intimate relationship to the predictable elements. What are the predictable elements? They are of at least 4 kinds. The first arises from the necessity of scheduling and coordinating our social actions. In every culture, most people most of the time structure their activities in terms of some notion of a normal day. They get up at roughly the same time each day, dress and wash or fail to wash, eat meals at set times, go to work and return from work at set times, and so on. Those who prepare the food have been able to expect those who eat to appear in particular times and particular places. The secretary who picks up the telephone in one office has to be able to expect the secretary in another office to answer it. The bus and train must meet the travelers at prearranged points. We all have a great deal of tacit, unspelled out knowledge of the predictable expectations of others, as well as a large stock of explicitly stored information. Thomas Schelling, in a famous experiment, told a group of 100 subjects that they had the task of meeting an unknown person in Manhattan on a given date. The only other fact they knew about the unknown person was that he knew everything that they know. What they had to supply was the time and place for the encounter. More than 80 of them selected the spot under the large clock in the concourse of Grand Central Station at 12 noon, and precisely because over 80% gave this answer, it is the right answer. What Schelling's experiment suggests is that we all know more about what other people's expectations about our expectations are, and vice versa, than we usually recognize. A second source of systematic predictability in human behavior arises from statistical regularities. We know that we all tend to catch more colds in winter, that the suicide rate rises sharply around Christmas, that multiplying the number of qualified scientists at work on a well-defined problem increases the probability that it will be solved sooner rather than later, that Irishmen are more likely than Danes to be mentally ill, that the best indicator of how a man will vote in Britain is how his best friend votes, that your wife or husband is more likely to murder you than a criminal stranger, and that everything in Texas tends to be bigger, including the homicide rates. What is interesting about this knowledge is its relative independence of causal knowledge. No one knows the causes of some of these phenomena, and about others many of us actually have false causal beliefs. Just as unpredictability does not entail inexplicability, so predictability does not entail explicability. Knowledge of statistical regularities plays as important a part in our elaboration and carrying out of plans and projects as does knowledge of scheduling and coordinated expectations. Lacking either, we would not be able to make rational choices between alternative plans in terms of their chances of success and failure. This is also true of the two other sources of predictability in social life. The first of these is the knowledge of the causal regularities of nature, that is, snowstorms, earthquakes, plague bacilli, height, malnutrition, and the properties of protein all place constraints on human possibility. The second is the knowledge of causal regularities in social life. Although the status of the generalizations which express such knowledge is in fact the object of my inquiry, that there are such generalizations and that they do have some predictive power is after all quite clear. An example to add to the fourth that I gave earlier would be the generalization that in societies such as Britain and Germany in the 19th and 20th centuries, by and large one's place in the class structure determined one's educational opportunities. Here I am talking about genuine causal knowledge and not mere knowledge of statistical regularity. We now are at least in a position to approach the question of the relation of predictability and to unpredictability in social life with a view to casting some positive light on the status of the generalizations of the social sciences. It is at once clear that many of the central features of human life derive from the particular and peculiar ways in which predictability and unpredictability interlock. It is the degree of predictability which our social structures possess, which enables us to plan and engage in long-term projects. And the ability to plan and engage in long-term projects is a necessary condition of being able to find life meaningful. A life lived from moment to moment, from episode to episode, unconnected by threads of large-scale intention, would lack the basis for many characteristically human institutions. For instance, marriage, war, the remembrance of the lives of the dead, the carrying on of families, cities and services through generations, and so on. But the pervasive unpredictability in human life also renders all our plans and projects permanently vulnerable and fragile. Vulnerability and fragility have other sources too, of course. Among them, the character of the material environment and our ignorance. But the thinkers of the Enlightenment in their 19th and 20th century heirs saw these as the sole, or at any rate the main sources of vulnerability and fragility. The Marxists added economic competitiveness and ideological blindness. All of them wrote as though fragility and vulnerability could be overcome in some progressive future. And it is now possible to identify the link between this belief and their philosophy of science. The latter, with its view of explanation and predication, played a central role in sustaining the former. But with us, the argument now has to move in the other direction. Each of us, individually and as a member of particular social groups, seeks to embody his own plans and projects in the natural and social world. A condition of achieving this is to render as much of our natural and social environment as possible predictable, and the importance of both natural and social science in our own lives derives, at least in part, although only in part, from their contribution to this project. At the same time, each of us, individually and as a member of particular social groups, aspires to preserve his independence, his freedom, his creativity, and that inner reflection which plays so great a part in freedom and creativity from invasion by others. We wish to disclose of ourselves no more than we think right, and nobody wishes to disclose all of himself except perhaps under the influence of some psychoanalytic illusion. We need to remain to some degree opaque and unpredictable, particularly when threatened by the predictive practices of others. The satisfaction of this need to at least some degree supplies another necessary condition for human life being meaningful in the ways that it is and can be. It is necessary, if life is to be meaningful, for us to be able to engage in long-term projects, and this requires predictability. It is necessary, if life is to be meaningful, for us to be in possession of ourselves and not merely to be the creations of other people's projects, intentions, and desires, and this requires unpredictability. We are thus involved in a world in which we are simultaneously trying to render the rest of society predictable and ourselves unpredictable, to devise generalizations which will capture the behavior of others, and to cast our own behavior into forms which will elude the generalizations which others frame. If these are general features of social life, what will the characteristics of the best possible available stock of generalizations about... If these are the general features of social life, what will be the characteristics of the best available stock of generalizations about social life? It seems probable that they will have three important characteristics. They will be based on a good deal of research, but their inductively founded character will appear in their failure to approach law-likeness. No matter how well framed they are, the best of them may have to coexist with counterexamples, since the constant creation of counterexamples is a feature of human life, and we shall never be able to say of the best of them precisely what their scope is. It follows, of course, that they will not entail well-defined sets of counterfactual conditionals. They will be prefaced not by universal quantifiers, but by some such phrases as characteristically and for the most part, ... But just these, as I pointed out earlier, turned out to be characteristics of the generalizations which actual empirical social scientists claim with good reason to have discovered. In other words, the logical form of these generalizations, or the lack of it, turns out to be rooted in the form, or the lack of it, of human life. We should not be surprised or disappointed that the generalizations and maxims of the best social science share certain characteristics of their predecessors, the proverbs of folk societies, the generalizations of jurists, the maxims of Machiavelli, and it is indeed to Machiavelli that we now return. What the argument shows is that Fortuna is ineliminable, but this does not mean that we cannot say some more about her in at least two respects. The first concerns the possibility of a measure of Fortuna. One of the problems created by the conventional philosophy of science is that it suggests to scientists in general, and social scientists in particular, that they should treat predictive error merely as a form of failure, except when some critical question of falsification arises. If, instead, we kept careful records of error and made of error itself a topic of research, my guess is that we should discover that predictive error is not randomly distributed. To learn whether this is so or not would be a first step in doing more than I have done in this chapter, that is, to talking about the specific parts played by Fortuna in different areas of human life, rather than merely about the general role of Fortuna in all human life. The second aspects of Fortuna which require comment concerns its permanence. I earlier disclaimed the status of proof for my arguments. How then can I have grounds for believing in the permanence of Fortuna? My reasons are partly empirical. For suppose that someone were to accept the argument so far and to agree in the identification of the four systematic sources of unpredictability, but was then to propose that we try to eliminate, or at least to limit as far as possible, the part that these sources of unpredictability play in social life. He proposes to prevent as far as possible the occurrence of situations in which conceptual innovation, or the unforeseen consequences of unmade decisions, or the game-theoretic character of human life, or pure contingency, can disrupt the predictions already made, the regularities already identified. Could such a man achieve his goal? Could he render a now unpredictable social world wholly or largely predictable? Clearly, his first step would have to be the creation of an organization to provide an infrastructure for his project, and equally clearly, his first task would have to be to render the activity of his own organization wholly or largely predictable. For if he were unable to achieve this, he could scarcely achieve his larger goal. But he would also have to render his organization efficient and effective, capable of dealing with its highly original task and of surviving in the very environment which it is committing to changing. Unfortunately, these two characteristics, total or near total predictability on the one hand and organizational effectiveness on the other, turn out to be the basis of the best empirical studies we have. Unfortunately, these two characteristics, total or near total predictability on the one hand and organizational effectiveness on the other, turn out, on the basis of the best empirical studies we have, to be incompatible. Defining the conditions of effectiveness in an environment that requires innovative adaptation, Tom Burns has listed such characteristics as continual redefinition of individual task, communication which consists of information and advice rather than instructions and decisions, knowledge may be located anywhere in the network, and so on. Burns, 1963, and Burns and Stalker, 1968. One can safely generalize what Burns and Stalker say about the need to allow for individual initiative, a flexible response to changes in knowledge. The multiplication of centers of problem-solving and decision-making is adding up to the thesis that an effective organization has to be able to tolerate a high degree of unpredictability within itself. Other studies confirm this. Attempts to monitor what every subordinate is doing all the time tend to be counterproductive. Attempts to make the activity of others predictable necessarily routinize, suppress intelligence and flexibility, and turn the energies of subordinates to frustrating the projects of at least some of their supervisors. Kaufman, 1973, and see also Burns and Stalker on the effects of attempts to subvert and circumvent managerial hierarchies. Since organizational success and organizational predictability exclude one another, the project of creating a wholly or largely predictable organization committed to creating a wholly or largely predictable society is doomed, and doomed by the facts about social life. Totalitarianism of a certain kind, as imagined by Aldous Huxley or George Orwell, is therefore impossible. What the totalitarian project will always produce will be a kind of rigidity and inefficiency which may contribute in the long run to its defeat. We need to remember, however, the voices from Auschwitz and Gulag Archipelago, which tell us just how long that long run is. There is nothing paradoxical in offering a prediction, vulnerable in the way that all social predictions are, about the permanent unpredictability of human life. Underlying that prediction is a vindication of the practice and of the findings of empirical social science, and a rebuttal of what has been the dominant ideology of much social science as well as of the conventional philosophy of social science. But that rebuttal entails also a large rejection of the claims of what I called bureaucratic managerial expertise. And with this rejection, one part of my argument at least has been completed. The expert's claim to status and reward is fatally undermined when we recognize that he possesses no sound stock of law-like generalizations, and when we realize how weak the predictive power available to him is. The concept of managerial effectiveness is, after all, one more contemporary moral fiction, and perhaps the most important of them all. The dominance of the manipulative mode in our culture is not and cannot be accompanied by very much actual success in manipulation. I do not, of course, mean that the activities of the purported experts do not have effects, and that we do not suffer from these effects and suffer gravely. But the notion of social control, embodied in the notion of expertise, is indeed a masquerade. Our social order is, in a very literal sense, out of our, and indeed anyone's, control. No one is or could be in charge. Belief in managerial expertise is, then, on the view that I have taken, very like what belief in God was thought to be by Carnap and Eyre. It is one more illusion, and a peculiarly modern one, the illusion of a power not ourselves that claims to make for righteousness. Hence, the manager as character is other than he first seems to be. That is, the social world of everyday hard-headed, practical, pragmatic, no-nonsense realism, which is the environment of management, is one which depends for its sustained existence on the systematic perpetuation of misunderstanding and of belief in fictions. The fetishism of commodities has been supplemented by another just as important fetishism, that of bureaucratic skills, for it follows from my whole argument that the realm of managerial expertise is one in which what purport to be objectively grounded claims function in fact as expressions of arbitrary but disguised will and preference. Keynes's description of how More's disciples advanced their private preferences under the cover of identifying the presence or absence of a non-rational property of goodness, a property which was in fact a fiction, deserves a contemporary sequel in the form of an equally elegant and telling description of how in the social world of corporations and governments, private preferences are advanced under the cover of identifying the presence or absence of the finding of experts. And just as the Keynesian description suggested why emotivism is so convincing a thesis, so would such a modern sequel. The effects of 18th century prophecy have been to produce not scientifically managed social control, but a skillful dramatic imitation of such control. It is histrionic success which gives power and authority in our culture. The most effective bureaucrat is the best actor. To this, many managers and many bureaucrats will reply, "You are attacking a straw man of your own construction. We make no large claims, Weberian or otherwise. We are keenly aware of the limitations of social scientific generalizations, as you are. We perform a modest function with a modest, unpretentious competence, but we do have specialized knowledge. We are entitled in our own limited fields to be called experts." Nothing in my argument impugns these modest claims, but it is not claims of this kind which achieve power and authority either within or for bureaucratic corporations, whether public or private. For claims of this modest kind could never legitimate the possession or the uses of power either within or by bureaucratic corporations in anything like the way or on anything like the scale on which that power is wielded. So the modest and unpretentious claims embodied in this reply to my argument may be themselves highly misleading, as much to those who utter them as to anyone else, for they seem to function not as a rebuttal of my argument that a metaphysical belief in managerial expertise has been institutionalized in our corporations, but as an excuse for continuing to participate in the charades which are consequently enacted. the histrionic talents of the player with small walking-on parts are as necessary to the bureaucratic drama as the contributions of the great managerial character actors.